Section 2 of Imperialism and World Politics, Part 4 of 4, by Parker Thomas Moon. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Alistair. Chapter 18a, The League and its Mandates, Part 1. Subsection, Secret Treaties or Self-Determination. If Mr. David Lloyd George, then Prime Minister of England, meant what he said on January 5th, 1918, he was uttering a challenge to the whole philosophy of modern imperialism, as well as the policy to which his own government had pursued up to that moment. In defining the war aims of the Allies, he declared that the
principle of national self-determination
was
as applicable
to the German colonies as to the European peoples, for the native chiefs and councils could be consulted as to the representatives of their tribes. Applying the principle of self-determination to African and South Sea tribes was a relatively novel and certainly a revolutionary idea in itself, but Mr. Lloyd George added that the governing consideration should be
to prevent their exploitation for the benefit of European capitalists or governments.
Taken at its face value, this declaration would mean an end of imperialism for the German colonies, and once it had been applied to them, its application to other colonies could not consistently be denied. Self-determination and empire are irreconcilable foes. Why the British Premier made so amazingly radical a statement will be explained in a later paragraph, but first it is interesting to observe how diametrically opposed his utterance was to the policies hitherto pursued by the Allies. By a series of secret treaties and secret agreements, the governments of the Allied powers had arranged, in anticipation of victory, for the division of colonial spoils. France and England had exchanged notes, 1916, providing for the annexation of the former German colonies in Africa. France and Great Britain promised to Italy, by the Secret Treaty of London, April 26, 1915, compensation if they enlarged their possessions in Africa, the compensation being in the form of additions to the Italian colonies in that continent. Moreover, the British Union of South Africa expected to annex German Southwest Africa, which had been occupied by the Boers, and Belgium hoped to share in German East Africa, which troops from Belgian Congo had helped conquer. As for the German colonies in the Far East, Great Britain in February 1917 had undertaken to support Japan's claims regarding the disposal of German rights in Shantung and the German islands north of the equator.
It being understood that the Japanese government will treat in the same spirit Great Britain's claims to the German islands south of the equator.
France and Russia and Italy assented to this bargain. Thus the German colonies were to be appropriated, without reference to self-determination, and without any thought of preventing exploitation. Not only the German colonies, but also Turkey and Persia were considered legitimate spoils of imperialism. In March 1915, Great Britain and France had promised to Russia a portion of Turkey, including Constantinople, and a free hand in northern Persia, it being agreed that the neutral zone in Persia should be added to the British sphere of influence, and that the claims of France and Great Britain in Turkey should be defined later. Next, by the Secret Treaty of April 26, 1915, the Allies assured Italy that she would have Dodecnesia and her just share in the partition of Turkey, and mentioned the Adalia district of Asia Minor as being earmarked for Italy. Franco-Russian and Anglo-French agreements in the spring of 1916 assigned Turkish Armenia, in addition to Constantinople, to Russia. Syria, Cilicia, and a sphere of influence stretching eastward as far as the Persian border, to France. Mesopotamia, some ports in Palestine, and a broad sphere of influence besides Cyprus, to Great Britain. Italy's just share was more precisely demarcated in 1917, so as to include not only Adalia, but the whole southern coast of Anatolia, and also the province of Smyrna. In sharp contrast to this official, and secret, policy of annexationist imperialism there grew up during the Great War an opposing policy, which explains Lloyd George's speech, and, more important, gave birth to the existing system of colonial mandates. Opposition to imperialism was, of course, no novelty, as the early chapters of this book must have made clear. The significant features of the wartime opposition were the ideas of native self-determination and of internationalism. To trace the development of these ideas would be beyond the scope of this volume, but the anti-imperialist opinions will be of interest in explaining the origin of the mandate system. Footnote: see P.B. Potter, Origin of the System of Mandates, American Political Science Review, November 1922. Walter Russell Batzel, in a book now in preparation, will cover this subject in detail. End footnote. In a vivid little book that was much read in the United States, Mr. Walter Lippmann, as early as 1915, reminded a forgetful public that the real stakes of diplomacy were being ignored by pacifists. They will not face the fact that the diplomatic struggle, the armed peace, and the war itself revolves about the exploitation of weak territories. The task of internationalism, he concluded, was to destroy the imperialist theory that a businessman must rely on his home government for support when he ventures into backward areas. This is the central nerve of imperialism, and our business is to excise it. The method he recommended was ingenious. European conferences such as the Algeciras Conference on Morocco should not be disbanded when they adopted a treaty, but should continue in existence as a kind of senate meeting from time to time, and supervising the administration of the treaty. Ultimately, there would be one of these continuing conferences, or international senates, for each of the sore spots where world crises originate, acting as a sort of upper house, while a native assembly would constitute the lower house. Colonial administration would gradually become internationalized. Men going into backward countries would look to these new institutions, rather than to their home governments, for protection. There would no longer be need of armed interventions and crises, and competitive imperialism would be deprived of its excuse and its stimulus. In England, somewhat similar proposals were made. Mr. J. A. Hobson, eminent economist and anti-imperialist, felt as Mr. Lippmann did that the provisions of the Algeciras Act for international regulation of administration in Morocco indicated a direction in which a solution might be sought. Footnote: his book on imperialism is the classic indictment of imperialist doctrines and practices. End footnote. He suggested that under the supervision of an international council, an individual nation might be given the right of intervention and even of political control in a backward country under an express agreement to preserve the open door. This sort of proposal had firm historic roots in the Morocco negotiations of 1906. Secretary Root, in correspondence about Morocco at the time, had referred to France and Spain as mandatories, and Roosevelt had used the term mandate. The name, as well as the idea, can be traced back at least that far, and perhaps something analogous to the idea may be found in the Berlin Act of 1885, placing the Congo Basin under certain international restrictions and prescribing, in particular, the open door. But to return to English ideas during the Great War, we find Mr. Philip Kerr, editor of the Round Table, speaking in 1916 of trusteeship and tutelage as the proper relationship between colonies and their possessors. Kerr and other British students interested in imperial problems, a group of writers often known as the Round Table Group, were probably a very important link in the chain that leads to the mandate system. The idea of international control of colonies was given greater popular vogue through the Memorandum on War Aims adopted by the Executive Committee of the British Labour Party in August 1917. Condemning imperialism roundly, it proposed that all Central Africa from sea to sea and from the Zambezi to the Sahara, including the Belgian, British and French colonies, and Liberia, as well as the conquered German protectorates, should be administered by an impartial commission with its own trained staff, under the authority of the League of Nations that was to be established. There should be an open door for international trade, and the natives should be specially protected against expropriation and exploitation. Criticising this program of international administration as impracticable, the Independent Labour Party published a declaration toward the end of the same month, suggesting in place of direct international administration a plan of delegating the government of colonies to individual European states under the supervision of an international commission. In somewhat modified form, these conceptions found their place in the Declaration of War Aims adopted by the Inter-Allied Labour Conference, which met in London in February 1918. The representatives of labour organisations and socialist parties in most of the Allied countries put themselves on record in this declaration as favouring the frank abandonment of every form of imperialism. The colonies of all the belligerents in tropical Africa should be placed under a system of control established by international agreement under the League of Nations and maintained by its guarantee, which, whilst respecting national sovereignty, would be alike inspired by broad conceptions of economic freedom and concern to safeguard the rights of the natives. In particular, this system would take account of the wishes of the natives, it would defend their rights as regards land ownership, and it would devote all colonial revenues to the well-being of the colonies themselves. Premier Lloyd George's speech of January 5, 1918, should be seen in this setting. It was made after the British Labour Party had been committed to its anti-imperialist platform. The clever Welsh statesman was endeavouring to dispel the idea that the Allies were fighting for the fulfilment of imperialist secret treaties which had been published that winter. Yet he did not abrogate the treaties. More sincere, but even less specific, was the principle laid down by President Wilson in point 5 of his 14-point speech, January 8, 1918. 5. A free, open-minded and absolutely impartial adjustment of all colonial claims based upon a strict observance of the principle that in determining all such questions of sovereignty, the interests of the populations concerned must have equal weight with the equitable claims of the government whose title is to be determined. Between the lines one can easily read two conceptions characteristic of Wilsonian policy, namely, his earnest desire to prevent the peace settlement from becoming a sordid division of spoils, and his hatred, often expressed before 1918, of imperialist greed and exploitation. Yet the vagueness of point 5 shows how far he was from any specific plan for a mandate system. His first draft of the Covenant, made in the summer of 1918, contained no provision for such a system. Subsection: President Wilson and the Mandate System. The mandate system was in reality a compromise between the imperialist secret treaties mentioned above and the liberal anti-imperialist ideas of which a few illustrations have been given. The form of the compromise was suggested to Wilson's mind by a pamphlet written in December 1918 by General Jan Smuts of South Africa, and therefore General Smuts has been regarded as the father of the mandate system. Yet the fundamental idea was not the exclusive invention of the South African statesman. He was certainly familiar with the theories of the Round Table Group and the proposals of British Labour, and perhaps was more of a transmitter than an inventor in this matter. Curiously enough, too, Wilson might have met with the idea among his own advisers. Walter Lippmann, whose book has been mentioned, was prominent in the House inquiry which prepared data for the President on war aims and peace terms. George Lewis Beer, who served on this inquiry as an expert on African problems, wrote a confidential memorandum on Mesopotamia for the United States government in December 1918, suggesting that backward regions such as Mesopotamia might be
entrusted by international mandate to one state,
and that
there should be embodied in the deed of trust most rigid safeguards to protect the native population from exploitation, and also to ensure that the interests of other foreign states are not injured.
General Smuts proposed that the territories formerly belonging to Russia, Austria-Hungary, and Turkey should be placed under the authority of the League of Nations, which could then delegate its authority over any given area to some other state whom it may appoint as its agent or mandatory, subject to the restrictions specified by the League in a special act or charter, and subject also to the rule that, whenever possible, the agent or mandatory so appointed shall be nominated or approved by the autonomous people or territory. Though he here suggests the name and the mechanism, General Smuts had no intention of applying the mandate system to the former German colonies in Africa and the Pacific, nor should one expect him to, for he was one of the leading Boer imperialists and intended that German Southwest Africa and German East Africa should be annexed by their Boer and British conquerors. President Wilson, having read the Smuts Plan, incorporated the provisions for mandates in his second draft of the Covenant, which was printed and distributed in January 1919. While adopting most of the Smuts provisions, even to the wording, Wilson made significant changes. He omitted Russia and included the former German colonies, along with the former Austro-Hungarian and Turkish possessions. He strengthened the provisions for the League's authority over mandates. No weak compromise, but a genuine system of League control was to be established. Had this conception of the mandate system prevailed, many of the ambiguities and uncertainties which now embarrass the organisation would have been avoided. Between the Wilson Plan for mandates and the Allied secret treaties there was a first battle, then a compromise, at the Paris Peace Conference in 1919. Forgetful of his year-old pledge regarding the self-determination of the German colonies, the nimble-witted Mr. Lloyd George fired the first gun in the battle in the Supreme Council on January 23rd, by proposing that the colonial spoils, in Africa, the Near East and the Pacific, should be divided up at once, even before the urgent problems of European boundaries were considered. Premier Clemenceau of France and Foreign Minister Sonnino of Italy agreed, of course, but President Wilson was opposed. Next day, Lloyd George impressively brought in the Prime Ministers of New Zealand, Australia, South Africa, and Canada to demand with his approval the outright annexation of the German colonies which the British dominions had seized during the war. Japan, France, and Italy likewise entered their claims based on the secret treaties. President Wilson was adamant. Annexations could not be permitted. The world would say that the great powers first portioned out the helpless parts of the world, and then formed a League of Nations. Frankly, he thought such action would make the League of Nations impossible, and they would have to return to the system of competitive armaments with accumulating debts and the burden of great armies. His determination, more than his eloquence, finally brought the Allies to accept the principle that the German colonies and Turkish territories should be made mandates instead of being annexed. President Wilson's victory in principle was in part undone by the Allies when it came to the details. The wording of the long clauses which were finally inserted into the Versailles Treaty, as Article 22 of the Covenant, was due in the main to General Smuts and Mr. Philip Kerr, who had left the editorship of the Round Table to become Lloyd George's secretary, so a British writer informs us. Under their skillful editing, President Wilson's draft became quite unrecognisable. Its meaning and legal content were whittled down until they almost disappeared, and the fragment that remained was glossed over with brilliant rhetoric. The rhetoric was really charming. Where Wilson had bluntly specified the territories belonging to Austria-Hungary and Turkey and the German colonies, Article 22 used the Oraton circumlocution. To those colonies and territories which, as a consequence of the late war, have ceased to be under the sovereignty of the states which formerly governed them, and which are inhabited by peoples not yet able to stand by themselves under the strenuous conditions of the modern world, there should be applied the principle that the well-being and development of such peoples form a sacred trust of civilization, and that the securities for the performance of this trust should be embodied in this covenant. Where Wilson had definitely given the League the sovereign right of ultimate disposal, including the right to appoint either states or an organised agency as mandatories, the right of supervision and intimate control, and the right to receive appeals directly from the mandated area, the well-phrased second paragraph of Article 22 left it uncertain where the ultimate or sovereign authority rested, by whom and how the mandatories should be selected, or how much control the League could exercise. The paragraph reads, "The best method of giving practical effect to this principle is that the tutelage of such peoples should be entrusted to advanced nations who, by reasons of their resources, their experience, or their geographical position, can best undertake this responsibility, and who are willing to accept it, and that this tutelage should be exercised by them as mandatories on behalf of the League. While resources and experience would qualify the greater allies as mandatories, geographical position was inserted to give the inexperienced British dominions the German colonies they desired. The League's role was left ambiguous, so that the allies themselves might appoint themselves as mandatories and enjoy almost the powers that could have been secured by annexations. It may as well be explained in this connection that by Article 119 of the Treaty of Versailles, Germany renounces in favour of the principal allied and associated powers all her rights and titles over her oversea possessions. And similarly, Article 94 of the Turkish Treaty of Sèvres, never ratified, allowed the principal allied powers to draw the boundaries, select the mandatories, and formulate the terms of the mandates for Syria, Mesopotamia, and Palestine. In short, the Allied great powers took the appointment of mandatories and drafting of mandates out of the hands of the League, where Wilson had intended to place it. The League would merely approve the mandatories chosen and the terms formulated by the Allies themselves. Wilson's provision that the mandatory power should be nominated, or at least approved, by the people concerned was applied, in Article 22, only in Mesopotamia, Syria, and Palestine, and in a weakened form. The wishes of these communities must be a principal consideration in the selection of the mandatory. As a matter of fact, the wishes of the people were not consulted, and in the case of Syria, at least, the wishes of the natives were simply ignored, where Wilson would have provided that the League should endeavour to build up in as short a time as possible out of the people or territory under its guardianship a political unit which can take charge of its own affairs, and that the League could hear petitions for independence and at any time release such a people or territory from tutelage. The final text of Article 22 did not mention the right of appeal, nor did it specify whether the League or the interested mandatory power should have the right to decide when the people of the mandated territory have become able to stand alone. The most striking change in the Wilson Plan was the division of the mandates into three classes. The purpose of the change was to serve certain definite British interests. If Wilson's plan for the open door in all mandates had been adopted, British South Africa, Australia, and New Zealand would have been in embarrassing straits. Australia and New Zealand desired mandates over the German islands south of the equator, but were determined to close the door to Japanese immigration. British South Africa coveted a mandate over German Southwest Africa, and desired to incorporate that territory into a tariff union with itself, rather than maintain a tariff barrier along the extensive frontier through desert country. But as British South Africa had a protective tariff giving a preferential rebate to British goods, the application of such a tariff to the mandate would violate the open door. Accordingly, Article 22 grouped Southwest Africa and the South Pacific Islands in a separate class, now known as Class C, which can best be administered under the laws of the mandatory as integral portions of its territory. That is, they could be administratively absorbed, and the open door which existed under German rule could now be shut, as it has been. To satisfy French and British desires, Article 22 provided that
other peoples, especially those of Central Africa,
meaning of course simply the German possessions in Central Africa, need not be treated as adolescent nations preparing for independence, but may be administered virtually as ordinary colonies under
conditions which will guarantee the freedom of conscience and religion, subject only to the maintenance of public order and morals, the prohibition of abuses such as the slave trade, the arms traffic, and the liquor traffic, and the prevention of the establishment of fortifications or military and naval bases, and of military training of natives for other than police purposes and the defence of the territory, and will also secure equal opportunities for the trade and commerce of other members of the League.
These are the Class B mandates. Only the Class A mandates were considered to be, as Wilson intended all mandates to be, subject to a provisional tutelage that would end in independence. But Article 22 failed to apply to the Class A mandates, the specific guarantees against violation of the open door or exploitation of the natives. By such ingenious but not ingenuous rephrasing, General Smuts and Mr. Kerr moulded President Wilson's plan of trusteeship under genuine international control into a compromise nearer heart's desire, nearer the imperialist aspirations of the Dominion premiers and of European diplomats. The denaturing of the Mandate Plan was carried farther on May 7, 1919, when the Big Three made a provisional distribution of the B and C mandates. Great Britain was to have German East Africa, Belgium's claims to a portion being ignored. British South Africa was to have German Southwest Africa. New Zealand would have the German Samoan Islands. The British Empire would secure the phosphate island of Nauru. The other German islands south of the equator went to Australia, and those north of the equator to Japan. France and Great Britain would make a joint recommendation to the League of Nations regarding Togoland and the Cameroons, for the partition of which territories they had already made a secret agreement in 1916. It was also agreed that Great Britain, France, and Italy should appoint a committee to consider the application of Article 13 of the Treaty of London, dated 26th of April 1915, by which Italy had been promised compensation if Britain and France should appropriate the German colonies in Africa. Footnote: subsequently, Italy received additions to Italian Somaliland and Libya at the expense of France, Great Britain, and Egypt. End footnote. It was clear that France and Great Britain intended to carry out their secret treaties so far as possible, despite having accepted the mandate system in principle. The battle at the peace conference between Wilson's conception of trusteeship and European imperialism seemed to have ended in a compromise whereby the Allies thought that they were gaining the substance of annexation under the name and form of mandates. Probably Wilson could have purchased acceptance of his idea at no smaller price. He did not, however, obtain merely a name and a hollow form of League control. The principle of trusteeship and the mechanism of League supervision were achievements whose significance and value have become increasingly clear in actual practice. End of section 2.